All right. Welcome to HVAC Side Chats with me, Timothy Sovine, and
Oh, me, Grace Irvine.
yes, and we are doing a podcast that is pretty much exploring philosophy in fun and interesting ways, and taking you along with us for the ride.
Yeah.
So thankfully, Grace has done a lot of studying around the idea of philosophy. So she's going to start us off by
Oh,
explaining what exactly it is we're talking about. Because there's a lot of different ways people use philosophy that might not be accurate or exactly what we are considering philosophy for this show.
yeah, definitely. So philosophy can cover many bases. If we want to define it technically, it's basically the study of knowledge. I guess you can't really be super technical with philosophy, but the definition that we're probably going to run with most of the time is the study of knowledge. Um, the Greek translation is basically the love of wisdom, I'm pretty sure. Um, and so that's where we get the word philosophy is from philosophia. I believe. Tim, can you confirm that?
Yes, I can confirm that Philosophia was the original root of philosophy, and that was when philosophy in ancient Greece was literally anything that you're studying in an academic sense with like purpose to know. But
Yep. So
later on, oh, what are you gonna say?
I was gonna say, yeah. So like, it Pythagoras was considered a really important philosopher, even though we know him mostly for his math accomplishments. Mathematics would have fallen under philosophy in that time.
Exactly. Yeah. Anything. So even exercise science was a philosophy, math, astronomy, the study of storytelling. So all that was wrapped up
Yep.
in all under philosophia. But later on, there became a distinction between science, which is things that we can study with empirical evidence or the scientific method, and philosophy, which is pretty much covering things that we can't answer with science, like what does it mean to be conscious? We can't look at molecules and be like, oh, consciousness is 72.5. So we need to use things other than our empirical evidence to kind of reason what our meaning out of that data is.
Yeah. But I think that's interesting to say because even though science and math become more empirical, they still are based on a lot of the bigger questions which fall under the general philosophy. So like you the driving questions all come back to like similar basic,
Exactly. Is
which is cool.
science is wonderful, but if you don't have any philosophy behind it, even if you're not doing it formally, is like why would you be doing it? Which is pretty much a philosophical question. Why do
Yeah.
science? So they're
Yeah.
very much intrinsically intertwined,
Hmm.
and they're kind of
Definitely.
like brother and sister.
Yeah. With science being the baby brother.
Yeah, philosophy is older,
Yeah. um,
but science gets paid
that being
more.
what?
I said, but science gets paid more. It's a baby brother who has like a
Like a
six-figure job.
yeah. Well, good for you, science.
Yeah,
Um,
it's done well for itself.
I was gonna say that being said, even in the more like out there kind of side of philosophy, there's no evidence that can really support a lot of like these philosophical theories and discussions. There are like more practical philosophical questions, and then there are the more like kind of out there, like what is the meaning of life?
Yeah, exactly. There's some that are like you might not see why they're exactly worthwhile talking about in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually I think a great like tone setting for the podcast that we're doing now, talking about the process of doing philosophy is actually super super amazing, and those bigger questions are usually harder and have bigger implications to deal with,
Yeah.
and that's great practice with being as objective as you can with your logic, trying to think through things from multiple perspectives and seeing what comes out of that without letting your bias corrupt it in any way. So
Yeah.
it's like a lot of people have the idea of philosophy, or we're going to be talking about a lot of history, a lot of boring accounts of things, but it's really, really interesting stuff that has direct application to how you think, which is literally all we do.
That's true. And yeah, we can go all the way back to basically the classical era, like ancient Greece, and start there with all those awesome philosophers. But it spans all the way up until, now. Like, there are still people who are very prominent thinkers, and some of the more postmodern thinkers are very interesting too. So
exactly,
there's a lot to cover.
And then a lot of people feel like those classical philosophers might be like a more stale thing to talk about, but a lot of those had a lot of modern implications as well. Like those philosophies are still very like potent things to talk about even nowadays.
Even if most of them are wrong.
That's true, but they are interesting questions. So the questions can't be wrong. It's just their conclusions we can look at and be like, well, this is a little bit strange, but here's how we could answer this question nowadays as well.
Yeah. Back to what sort of philosophy can cover, we kind of talked about like the empirical side, or how it started with pretty much all knowledge and then moved into two different separate categories, if you will. They're also amongst like the bigger question side, so the not science side of philosophy. There's a lot that fits under there. So like topic wise, there'd be like religion, politics, even logic, which is basically its own language, which is kind of cool. I really want to go into that at some point. All of that can fall under philosophy. And basically, if you think about the humanities in general, I think you can probably fit almost everything in there.
Yeah, pretty much anything that doesn't have direct measurement. Or even like, so there might be parts that you can measure directly, but anything that you don't have empirical evidence for is usually a philosophical question you're answering with logic and inference and deduction.
Yeah.
And then talking about fine, like concrete definitions, in philosophy, there's a general consensus, I believe, from what I read, that there are three main branches things fall into. Metaphysics, which is the study of nature, of reality, which that can cover a whole lot. That's a big topic. So that's usually a lot of like religion falls into that category. A lot of, what is life? What are we? All that. Epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, which is like Descartes' poster child for this. What do I know? How can I know it? Is it even possible to know things in the first place? What does that imply when we answer these questions in certain ways? Mm-hmm. And then value theory, which is broken up into ethics, which is the study of human conduct, which seems more specific than the first two, but has the most direct implications, I think, to our day-to-day lives. So it's very interesting. And aesthetics, which is the study of the nature of beauty.
I love that.
So those are the three main categories that we're going to be talking about, and things generally fall under. And they're broad enough that pretty much covers anything you could imagine.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. When you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, like, there's just so much. There's just so much out there. And that's even if you're not going to be positing like your own questions, even if you're not going to be trying to delve in and sort of understand and ask things on your own, like going through the history of philosophy would take forever.
Exactly. There is a whole lot there. And then if you're trying to partake in the questions that you're studying, the other people like in the historical context are asking, then it is just pretty much infinite stuff to talk about.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about in our podcast.
Everything. What we're telling you is we're going to talk about literally everything. So stay tuned for as long as you're alive, and we also have the willpower to continue doing this.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because it would take a long time to actually hit that goal.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to reach it.
Oh, what did you say?
So I don't know if we're going to reach it.
Well, not with that attitude.
That's fair. So Timothy, just to give a sneak peek of what we're going to discuss, do you have a favorite philosopher?
It's a very good question. It's a hard question that I should have thought about before, since we knew we were going to be talking about this philosophy as the main topic of our podcast today. I think Nietzsche is very interesting because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what he believed and the ways that nihilism can apply to real life. I think people have a very narrow understanding of it, and I think it can actually be pretty optimistic depending on a certain light you look into. But that's a whole discussion for another day.
Yeah.
I feel so bad for him too. Just as a quick sneak peek, he did not like Nazis. His sister was like, "Hey Nazis, this is perfect for you guys. You should call dibs," and they did. And now everybody thinks of, like, not everybody, but a lot of people associate him with Nazis, and it would be so sad.
It's kind of a reference to be tied with.
Yeah. So poor Nietzsche. We should talk about him sometime. Do you have a favorite philosopher?
Yeah, it is a really hard question. So I've kind of thought about it, and I think, I don't know. I think I have like categories of like favorite philosophers, which is kind of cheating because then it's not really your favorite. You've like just like picked multiple and decided that this is my favorite of this kind.
So I'm gonna put you on the spot. What is your absolute favorite? Even though you said you haven't thought about this before.
Absolute favorite. So I actually in school used to go to a weekly like philosophical discussion group. We discussed leadership a lot, which is my minor. I minored in leadership studies, and so leadership studies often lends itself to a lot of philosophical implications because once you're in charge of people, that can mean a lot of things, and a lot of things can go wrong. So we talked about it a lot, and for an entire semester, we discussed Michel Foucault, and he was just a very interesting guy. And basically what we discussed in that class was just about like this idea of being the subject, being like an autonomous being. And I really enjoyed playing with those ideas a lot. I don't necessarily think that I would agree with everything that he thought, but I think...
Oh, yeah. Like,
yeah.
This is very few philosophers who I think I would agree with everything they would posit.
Yeah, but I think that was one of the most fun that I've had discussing some of those ideas was centered around like basically his writing. So I enjoy him a lot. But if we're talking religious philosophers, I actually kind of really like, what's his name? Oh man.
Well, you haven't given me anything to go on, so I have no idea.
I'm trying to think. Right. Augustine.
Augustine.
Yes, Augustine. I'm pretty sure. I don't want to like say the wrong.
Was Thomas Aquinas before or after Augustine?
I want to say after, but I could be so very wrong.
Okay, well, we'll also get into detail with that later. But why do you like the person that you are assuming is Augustine?
So it is Augustine, like 100% sure. So basically what I really liked, he wrote Confessions, and I read that for a philosophy class. And basically, so this is like religious philosophy more so than anything else, but he basically started out like not believing in God at all, being one of those really rambunctious, crazy kids that did bad things and stole and all that jazz. And then eventually, you know, the whole like repentance and became super religious. And it's basically Confessions goes through his journey of like being a terrible person, confessing that he was like a terrible person, and then how he came to religion. And then in that time that he was sort of extra religious, he played a lot with the idea of doubt, which I think is something that, as someone who grew up in a relatively religious family, well, you would know that. But I think it's something that isn't discussed a lot, and I think it should be. And I really liked his take on what doubt meant for him and how it fortified his faith more than like destroyed his faith. So I think that's something that's really cool, and I just really enjoyed reading that. And I like him. Yeah.
All right, very cool. And before we go any further, we should also talk a little bit about how to partake in a philosophical discussion. So I think I would say there would be just only two things we need to do. Step one is trying to understand the point of view being posited by any of the sides. If it's a third party, like someone we're reading, or if it's either you or me, understand it with the strongest possible arguments. Pretty much avoiding straw manning, trying to give it a charitable view and try to understand it on its own terms. And then we critically evaluate that thing that we were looking at and seeing if we can knock down what we put up as what we know.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds good.
Yeah. So no matter what we do, step one, we need to understand it as well as we can, if it's our thought or somebody else's, and then we need to see if we can knock it down. And if we can't, we're like, pretty stable. I'll keep that one.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. I was going to say, I feel like we should have a disclaimer. It's a little bit harder, I think, on like this platform, but a lot of times in the past when we've had these type of discussions, we tend to interrupt each other a lot before the thought is completed.
Yes.
We should probably avoid that. But if it does happen, it's not because we're trying to be rude to each other. It's because we've gotten the gist of what the other person's saying, or at least we think we do. And so we'll clarify and move on with what we want our response to be. So
yeah. It's also very hard. You're right. Without being in person, it's harder to get the the body language of when someone's done or when someone's about to talk. So it's really hard not to interrupt when you're just like a voice.
Yeah, definitely. So bear with us as we figure that out along the way.
Yes, interruption just means we're excited to talk about it. And we always have a nice rule of thumb where if someone thinks they got the gist of something and they start talking, but they don't quite have it, the other person reserves the right to be like, hold on, let me finish this. And there's no like, that's completely normal etiquette. That's like proper. That's how it's supposed to flow.
We're not angry at each other.
Yeah, but we should, for you lovely viewers, of which there are 0 right now, let each topic be filled out a little bit more fully than we usually would, because while I know what Grace knows to some extent, and we might have talked about some of these subjects before, so I'm like, oh yeah, that thought that you expressed earlier, you guys don't know. Probably. So unless you are very close friends of ours, which probably be our first few viewers, but I think Grace, you and I should let our thoughts play out longer than we usually do.
I agree.
So that anybody who may come back and listen won't be like, wait, I don't know what you're talking about. Why'd you move on? Like, oh yeah, of course. Bam, next subject.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just saying, since we're not used to doing that, it might take a little bit to...
Yes, that's our goal, but bear with us while we start moving towards that.
Yes. Good.
All right. So do you have, I think that was a good kind of roundup of what we think philosophy is and where we're going to be living in topics-wise for the future. Do you have any big questions you want to ask that we can discuss actively instead of giving our people definitions?
That is a good question. I mean, there are always...
I have one in mind if you don't have one.
Sorry?
I said I have one in mind if you don't have one.
Yeah, you can go ahead. I was going to say, I can probably think of like a million, but I wouldn't be able to choose just one, so go for it.
That's true. Well, I think a good start off to us asking questions and actively discussing them is, why bother with philosophy? Because a lot of people think it's boring, it doesn't make you any money, a lot of the things don't affect me. So why would anybody need to spend time in this realm of knowledge?
Well, it's fun.
And that's a very viable answer.
That's like my number one reason. Well, not reason, but like I genuinely enjoy the discussion of philosophical ideas, partially because it affects everyone. There is no, I mean, at least I found it hard to find a philosophical question that doesn't affect every person, no matter what. And I think that's kind of cool, so that you can basically flip it on every head and have a million different perspectives regarding the discussion, if that makes sense. Which is why I really enjoyed going to that, Thursday night weekly discussion group. I think also partially, like I said, like philosophy, like there's philosophy, even though it doesn't necessarily seem practical to discuss, it's the questions that we want to know as humans. I think there's a reason people are asking these questions, and there's a reason people have been asking them for so long, is because we want to know why we're here. We want to know if there's a higher power. We want to know if it's even worth being considered morally just or unjust. We want to know if, like there's so many things that we just accept as is, whatever our beliefs may be. And I think that the average person generally takes those things for granted, and we don't necessarily know that all those things are true. And I think it's worth exploring.
All right. I like that answer. I would say I definitely think it's a lot of fun. And I think a lot of people are more invested in those topics than they realize. Like you're saying, sometimes you like go through life and don't really question those things very much, but a lot of philosophical questions are very deeply rooted in the human experience. And when you start talking about them, even if someone's like, oh, I don't like talking about philosophy, you start talking about like, what is it to be human? It's hard not to be like, well, wait, this is what I think. This is like my experience. It's like a compulsion to explain your experience of what's going on, because they're so like deep-rooted questions.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think along that vein, it's very interesting because I think some people don't like philosophy because it challenges a lot of their beliefs and values if you start to have that discussion, or if you have a discussion with someone who has opposing views, like regarding that topic. And I think that's not fun a lot of the time for people if they feel like their beliefs or their values that like make them who they are as a person are being attacked or challenged. But I think that it's really, really important to have that along the lines of Foucault and Augustine. Fun facts. So they both basically said that like you need that in your life in order to be, for Foucault, in order to be an autonomous person, you need a council of people who will doubt you essentially and tell you and keep you on the right track, but doubt your actions so that you can be more grounded in your beliefs. And Augustine, basically the same idea with religion, like you must doubt yourself in order to know that this is something that you truly believe in. If you accept things at face value, then are you really accepting what, like the actual idea, or are you just going along life, this is how I was raised, this is what I was told, and just accepting things as is. So I think that I can understand why people don't like talking philosophy a lot, but I do think that it's a very important part, or very important to at least take on these ideas once or twice in your life, at least think about it a bit to see what you really think.
Exactly. And another fun fact, did you know that the same area of your brain that experiences pain, we're talking about like if you're in an MRI and you're seeing the activity of your brain objectively, the same area that experiences pain lights up when you're proven wrong. So it's the same. We don't know if the same neuron patterns fire, but it's in the same ballpark as feeling actual physical pain is seeing evidence that you're not correct. And philosophy is actually a very noble pursuit because it's so against a lot of our built-in systems in our brain. Like the blowback effect is when you're proven wrong, and then you believe stronger what was proven wrong because it hurts so much to feel that realization that you weren't correct all this time. So that's one of the reasons why those steps that we talked about earlier are so important. You need to walk into this conversation on purpose, looking to understand the other side charitably and being aware that you can't possibly know what is true or isn't true until you compare as many ideas as possible.
I think that's the number one thing to come into the conversation, is to know that, I mean, essentially philosophy is trying to find the truth, trying to find what is true. And I think that you kind of have to go into this conversation knowing that you don't know and knowing that it's very hard to know what is true. And I think, again, that's something that's hard to grapple with. But if you come in with that mindset, then you're going to learn so much more and appreciate the discussion so much more instead of feeling like your world is being attacked.
It becomes more cooperative than it does competitive. Even though you're both trying to actively prove things wrong, it's a cooperative effort to get to the truth instead of a competitive effort to win.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot who it was. There was someone very smart who was talking about the only way you can win an argument is to lose. Because if you win and you're wrong, then you are wrong and you made another person wrong because they believed you. Or if you're right, you gain nothing and you make somebody else feel bad. But if you lose, you gain knowledge. And if you have the mindset of someone who wants to gain knowledge, then it can be a positive experience. So your goal in every argument should be to lose because it's the only winning scenario. It's the only time you gain anything besides pride.
That's true. That's funny. I like that. But also, I'm thinking of the phrase, I think it's Socrates or Plato, or like the one thing I know is that I know nothing.
Mm-hmm.
A good rule of thumb.
And I think along that, like along what you talked about slightly earlier, is my big answer to that question. Why bother with philosophy is if you go through your life just accepting the first thing you hear, you're completely like RNG personality. Like everything you believe is kind of like random, happenstance, no logic, no cause behind it. You don't have a continuity between your thoughts. It's just kind of like, oh, okay, I heard that first. We're good.
Yeah.
But when you engage in philosophy, you actually get to actively construct your worldview, and depending on your philosophical view, thus your reality that you inhabit, and make it a wholesome, contiguous experience that makes more sense and is able to be more honest, and you're not dealing with a lot of cognitive dissonance or conflict with other people.
Definitely.
So it's worthwhile, folks. Give it a shot.
Give it a shot.
Well, if anybody hears this and they're sitting through complete first-time amateur podcast about this subject, then they're probably giving it a shot already. So good job. I'm proud of you, the hypothetical person.
It's great. It's wonderful.
It's very wonderful.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you want to talk about on that subject of why philosophy, or we're both very pro philosophy, and this is not really taking in all accounts. Is there anything about philosophy, not the subject itself, but maybe the practice of it, that you can understand why it is considered elitist or alienating or dry and boring, that you would want to address from another perspective?
I mean, one thing that I can think of is that, like, I mean, so while what we just discussed, the whole idea of like come into the process thinking that you're going to learn something, try to understand another's point of view, not everyone approaches philosophy like that. Even some really good philosophers are very stubborn in their perspectives and just bash other people. And I think that's something that it can be negative or not useful in this discussion. And that brings me along to like this idea that like ideologies that people hold true, kind of like I said, like define themselves. And I think that is often used for a lot of negative stuff in the world. So there's a negative side of philosophy, but I think what I understand of philosophy, like this idea that you're challenging these views, I think inherently combats that if you're doing it right, which is totally wrong for me to say, but like if you're doing it the way I want it to.
You got spinning it up already. They're not a real philosopher.
In regards to like being elitist, I don't know. I feel like I do think that a lot of people I think there's the connotation of philosophy not being accessible and not being practical, that like the people who study it, the people who like talking about it, are considered like weird intellectuals that just care only about like their, like they don't really have any I don't know, they just care about sounding smart. They care about having these discussions because essentially they're pointless from what some people's perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think that's where that comes from. But I don't think that's necessarily true either.
And I think a lot of it is kind of, so even when you're in the most like positive realm of philosophy and you're saying that, well, if you come to it with an open mind, you're way better off. This is the right way to do it, which is really funny because it's like saying objectively, this way of approaching things as if you could be wrong at any time is the right way to do it. So but it's hard to like talk about it without saying anything directly.
Right.
You just we'll put a question mark at the end of everything. But so that inherently makes people feel like you're judging how they have lived their entire lives. But I think a good perspective on this that I like to take is that if you are fortunate enough to be exposed to the idea of philosophy and in a like enthusiastic way, we're just really lucky. Like we didn't earn the right to see how good it is to question your own beliefs. We fell into that kind of scenario and we're like, oh snap, this is really good. And a lot of people don't get exposed to that in a positive way. And like the first time you get exposed to something, it's the most impactful by a long shot. So a lot of people run into it. Maybe they run into a pretentious person who likes to do philosophy, air quotes, right? But really they're trying to prove everybody wrong. And they're just unlucky because they didn't run into a super enthusiastic professor or a parent who really wanted to instill this worldview to their children because they were lucky enough to experience it on their own.
Definitely.
So it's not like, hopefully, again, true Scotsman, hopefully any like philosopher worth their weight in like something valuable would know that they're lucky to have been exposed to the love of wisdom.
Yeah. I think it's funny too though, because I think philosophy is like, it's actually true that some philosophers literally write in a very complicated, weird way so that only other philosophers or only people who are trying to understand this content will do the effort and like actually like try to understand what this person's saying. I'm trying to think of the word for that. It's like, I can't think of the word. There's a word about not like clandestine information, but like basically making something, it means something, but it's really hard to understand, or you can't take the words at face value because that's not exactly what they mean.
There's a linguistically, jargon is field-specific terms that are not in the general like lexicon. So I don't think that's what you're thinking of, but I mean, I think that's another way to say it. Like there's a lot of philosophical jargon that grows upon itself into a horrendous beast of language that's hard to untangle.
Definitely. I'm actually thinking of a specific like way of writing. Let me see. I might be able to actually find what I'm looking for.
So while you're Googling that, are you talking about the intent? Is it like, are there these philosophers that have the intent of having an like obscure writing style to make sure it's only accessible to certain people, or is it something that happens to evolve out of these century-long discussions? Because philosophy does have like century-long discussions, and then there's ideas built upon ideas built upon ideas, and each person's doing their own working definitions of these words. And then that naturally causes some complicated like nature of it. But are the words you're thinking of for intent on that, or just the phenomenon?
So the word I'm looking for is on intent. It's esoteric. It's so that's what I was looking for. But I do think that it arises in both planes. Like, so there are definitely those pretentious philosophers who are like, I'm going to write this so that only a small amount of people can understand it. So that'd be like esoteric writing, versus that's like become the way that people communicate in the philosophy field now. So access it. Yeah. It
just like snowballs, because a lot of times when you're starting like these, like a big philosophical argument, you need to define what you mean by those words, because a lot of times you're aware that words can mean different things to different people. And then when you create these working definitions and then someone else references those and then creates their working definition with your working definition, you can end up with some
Yeah.
crazy situations.
Yeah, and that's basically all philosophy is, because you kind of, like you said, you have to define your terms, or else you're forced to be read from the perspective of other people's definitions, and that's not necessarily how you want it to be.
Yeah, and then I think talking about philosophy, there's a lot of philosophers who are more accessible than others, and I think there's definitely like a curve of exposure that's more productive than others. Like Heidegger was a German philosopher who talked a lot about technology and societal or like organization, and he is so hard to read. Like, oh my gosh.
It's
It's like
hard.
insane. And he's hard in German, but when you translate German to English and you lose some words that mean like entire like paragraphs by themselves,
Yeah.
And you add he has a crazy style in German, like
Yeah.
I definitely needed a professor of philosophy there to help walk through what the heck this guy was talking about. And then when we did, you're like, okay, I see it now. But sometimes others are easier to read through. I think Descartes was like one of the first ones I ever read, and it was much easier to digest and see where he's coming from. That's why the classical ones are actually pretty handy, because they're not like centuries into the conversation. They're kind of like the kickstarting what
true.
this is, and they're not as insane.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that I agree, especially with the ones that are translated. And if you try to make it simpler, it basically like you lose a lot of the argument. And so like that's why like synopses and like summaries of these books and papers by philosophers are helpful in understanding what they're actually getting at. I find that if you actually read like if you research the theory in general terms first and then try to read it, it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, like when you have an idea of what ballpark he's talking about, and you're like, oh, okay, I kind of see what's going on here.
Or maybe read it at face value, which is probably a better practice. Try to read it at face value, and then maybe once, if you feel like you aren't getting very far, go to like the general discussion and reread it after that. And then that way you can have your own perspective, kind of, and then also be able to apply what people have been, taking from it before. So,
yeah, very true, very true. Philosophy can be hard sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So I think that's also why people find it inaccessible to an average person. Like if you expect someone to be able to partake in a philosophical discussion as someone who has to have read philosophers, I think that's what I dislike about philosophical discussions sometimes, because you can have a stake in a philosophical discussion regardless of if you know different philosophers and different philosophers' perspectives.
Yeah.
I think you can have your own perspectives on the question, but there are definitely people out there who are like, well, you need to have backup on that perspective, or, like this philosopher believed this. Like if you aren't referencing philosophers, then they don't take you seriously. So.
Yeah, but I think you're right. There's a lot of viable, like real input you can have without knowing the history of the discussion so far. Like it helps to know that. It's not a bad thing, but I don't think personally that is anywhere near a requirement to take part in a constructive philosophical discussion.
Definitely.
Like with Heinz in the released in the future when we are super famous episode, we were talking about a like really popular common philosophical problem and our thoughts on it, and we didn't really have to reference other philosophers' takes on this situation at all. It was kind of read what the problem was, and we discussed our experience and input on that situation without having to be like, well, Descartes said, well, Heidegger would say this.
Yeah. I think that's what people don't realize all the time, or at least like sometimes people who study philosophy, in my experience, can get kind of pretentious in that sense. And that's why people are a little bit more deterred from the philosophical discussions. But you don't need any basis. You just need to be a person who can experience things.
Yes.
And that's all you need.
And even then, hey, if we learn how to communicate with dolphins, I would love to hear dolphins' perspectives on these.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like,
you could be a sentient being. You could be something that's aware of its own existence, and then you're good. That is interesting no matter what.
Yeah.
This is Actually, side note, I always have this problem where like there's an interesting thing that doesn't quite fit into the conversation, but it's like relevant to the general topic and like to flow past it, but I want to bring it up. I feel like we're at like
Sure.
a good like wrapping up point for that last part. So I want to call back to when you were talking about people taking their opinions as their personality. So this is an example of referencing something like somebody who has a discussion of this before, but totally not a philosopher. Well, I guess technically anybody can be a philosopher. CGP Grey, who is a YouTuber, he has a podcast and he talks about how people identify themselves with their opinions. And it's easier if you view your opinions as something you collect and exchange, like kind of objectify them a little bit so that they're separate from yourself. And then you identify yourself as your principles. So instead of being like, I'm Tim and I like electric cars, I'm like, I'm Tim and I like things that like produce a sustainable like lifestyle. And if it turns out electric cars cost more in their carbon footprint than using a used car for as long as its lifespan, which actually happens to be true, I don't feel bad for switching out those opinions because I don't identify as that opinion. I identify as the principle that helped me decide that opinion in the first place. And I thought that was like a genius, like it was simple, but I was like, holy crap. If we all thought like this, you know how amazing life could be?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's something that people should do. Yeah, I've never heard someone like actually put it out like that, but I think that I don't know, I don't think I've discussed that sort of perspective before, but I definitely think that like if you go to the root of your beliefs rather than like just the belief itself, that changes everything.
Yeah, it helps you feel like it helps you engage in these philosophical discussions without feeling like you're losing part of your identity every time, which is a pretty bad feeling. You're like,
yeah. I think people put stake in what they believe a lot, which is like fair because it affects your life, but at the same time, like too much stakes are high.
Yeah, the stakes are high, and I think it's fine to put really high stakes in principles because those are hard to like prove wrong, right? So it's like I like when you said that you believe this is referencing something that the viewers will not have seen yet, but Grace earlier said that she believes that human life is more important than the right to property. That's a very basic principle, and then we talked about complications in the scenario itself, where the actions that we took initially based on that principle could have caused the inverse effect. So basically, the decision she made, she could have hurt her principle, so she could also just change her mind about the actual specific action because it still reinforced the principle.
Yeah. But I also think that's interesting because I feel like people justify their actions based off of the principle, like if they acted on a principle that they hold to be true, but they took it at face value, they didn't like think through the consequences. They depend on that initial decision saying it was in a good place, even if it caused a lot more issues. Which, I mean, I guess there's some truth to that. There, you know, you have to give people credit for thinking they're doing right, but at the same time, it's not worth it.
That's true. I definitely want to clarify. Principles themselves aren't inherently good. It's just that if you're basing your arguments off of something, it should be principles and not specific opinions, because specific opinions could change with the slightest change in data.
Yeah.
But principles should be a little bit more foundational, but you should take your time. You shouldn't whimsically decide your principles. Those should be like the very essence of who you are. So
yeah, I was thinking if you're acting on a principle, so assuming the principle is a positive thing, if you're acting on that principle but you act too hastily basing your decision off of that principle, which therefore kind of basically what you were saying, like if I had chosen one thing that actually made more people die, essentially, but I value human life over property, then I technically had my heart in the right place, but like just didn't realize the implications of my decision.
Yeah, so there's always like, of course, no one's omnipotent, so you can't truly always have the optimal answer to your principles, but you should always be aware that the thing that initially feels like it's right might not be correct if you take in the whole system.
That's true.
Which is really hard to do because systems are big and brains aren't really meant to understand that many connections simultaneously. So we need to use models to kind of like level things out, but
yeah,
be careful.
Systematic thinking is always interesting too. I feel like we could discuss that.
Take your time, critical thinking, super important.
Yes. I think we've definitely gone off on a tangent there for a while.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's a very valuable one, and I think it still relates a little bit to, well, a lot to people partaking in philosophy and why it matters, and the idea of having your opinions and principles separated is pretty much a core element of being able to partake in philosophy effectively.
Yeah.
It's just we're just like drawing out that explanation of how that mindset helps into a lot of detail, but it's in like a nice subset of our conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
All right. And I think that's actually a pretty good overview of what we're talking about for the rest of the podcast. Do you have anything else you want to add as a nice wrap up to this whole tangle of conversation?
I think I just want to reiterate a few things, and essentially we've reiterated this a lot, but one, philosophy is accessible to anyone. All you have to do is be able to think and speak on your own experience, and you can be part of the discussion. And two, to always try to have an open mind. Try being the operative word, because sometimes you don't realize if you're being closed-minded, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So, hopefully we will see some of our Zero viewers again in the future, and we'll have some new ones.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Grace, for coming on and hosting the show with me.
Anytime. Thank you.
All right. Our resident expert just dropped in, and we didn't have a chance to ask her about anything. But thank you, April, for stopping by.
Yeah.
There you go, guys. You heard from resident expert. She says yes. Very good first thing to say. If you only say one thing, that's probably a good one.
Yeah.
Wrong.
Alen's yes to murder.
Yeah, then that's bad.
Alen's to murder saves more people from being murdered. This is a good question. This is something we could have an episode on. So we'll leave it here before another hour passes. And I'm going to stop the broadcast and see if it stops our conversation.